All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this installment of the Tattoo Historian Presents. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian, and I have three sponsors to thank tonight, which is pretty awesome. But first, I want to thank you all for coming out. It's a beautiful day outside, and you've decided to come into the air conditioning and hear a little history, so we're very happy about that. It's good to see everyone up at the bar and having a good time. First, I want to thank Gettysburg Foundation for their continued support. I'm a proud member of the Recruit program, so thank you guys for that. Thank you also to the Gettysburg National Military Park for being a sponsor for this one. And last but not least, I want to thank Civil War Trails for being a sponsor. We actually have some of their brochures here about the attack on Washington, which we're going to be talking about tonight. Drew Gruber, I want to give a special shout out to him for helping us along. You may have heard about them a lot on the live streams we did from Monocacy. They are the largest open-air museum in the country, and they have dozens of these brochures of different areas where their wayside markers are, so I want to give them a special shout out for sponsoring tonight's program as well. And a very special shout out to my guest. Steve Phan is here with us this evening. Did you bring your fan club with you?
Yes, I do. I see him in the audience right now.
This is what a microphone's for.
Yeah, my biggest fan's off to the left there, Chris Gwynn. I see John Heiser here, my friend Anthony. And I even had people from D.C. follow me all the way up here. So I may have driven them, but they are here. So
Did you drag them along, or did they come willingly?
They volunteered to come, actually.
Oh.
It's a big surprise.
Okay, that's awesome. But Steve has been a friend of mine for a while, and we were Facebook friends first. And then we kind of started to be fans of each other.
Indeed.
And we decided to work together on some things here in the future, and this is one of them. So I'm so glad you've been able to come up here this evening and take part in this.
Happy to be here. It's always fun to escape the heat of D.C. It's even hotter in D.C. than it is in Gettysburg. Imagine that. So a nice little respite, and I'm happy to be here amongst friends.
So we have, those of you who watched the live stream that I did from Monocacy with my friends, we talked about earliest campaign into Maryland, and Steve is going to be talking about the Fort Stevens events and stuff going on down there 155 years ago. How long ago was that? A couple days ago, right?
Yes. Yeah. We had our anniversary program this past Saturday, but July 11th and 12th were the battles of Fort Stevens.
Right.
So just about a week ago.
Right, so it was really cool to be doing some outreach with that and talking about that campaign in 1864 because a lot of people forget about it, which is kind of weird. But diving down into it, Steve, give everyone here and watching a little bit of your background before we get really into the weeds of Fort Stevens.
Well, yes, I'm a park ranger for the Civil War Defenses of Washington. We manage 17 Civil War sites around the National Capital Region in D.C., and we work with 3 national parks in the region to manage these sites. I work a lot with Rock Creek Park in the northern part of D.C. We manage several sites there, including Fort Stevens. My office is at Battleground National Cemetery, which is also managed by Rock Creek Park. That's where 40 soldiers are originally interred that were killed in action during the battle, federal soldiers. We oversee sites on the southeast side across the Anacostia River as well. We call that National Capital Parks East, or NACE. And when you think of NACE, think of Frederick Douglass House and Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. And then we also manage Fort Marcy on the George Washington Memorial Parkway. So those are the 3 sites we work with. There's a ton of Civil War history in Washington, D.C., and I'm very grateful and have the opportunity to travel around the city and do a lot of different programming. So that's what I've been trying to connect visitors to, not only the defenses of Washington, but Civil War Washington in general.
Yeah, and I've laid out some of the brochures from Civil War Defenses of Washington on each of the tables. You're more than welcome to take one because I stole them from them.
That's right.
At Monocacy, they had a nice spread, and I'm like, I'll take like 20 of these. So they're there for you to take with you this evening as well. But how do you want to start out this evening, Steve? This is your show this evening, and I would love for you to start us out with Early's drive into Maryland and into Fort Stevens.
I think I'd like to start with just the idea of fortifying Washington, which really began in the early spring of 1861 when federal engineers in the Federal Army reconnoitered the area around D.C., and they made some conclusions and suggestions to the Army High Command, and this was right after Lincoln was elected. So coming to the end of 1860 into 1861, and the engineers say, hey, if you look across the Potomac River and you see Arlington, Virginia, including where the Lee property was at there, that's formidable high ground. They called it the Arlington Heights. And they were fearful if Virginia joined the rest of the Confederacy that the Confederate Army could roll up artillery to shell the city. And so the engineers, including General John G. Barnard, he's the father or the chief engineer of the defenses and really saw them from their foundation to their major development, said, we might have to take the initiative with this. So in May, late May, when the federal government realized that Virginia would secede from the Union, federal soldiers in 3 different columns crossed the Potomac River that evening, occupied Arlington Heights, moved down to Alexandria the next day, and they immediately started building earthworks. So well before First Manassas or Bull Run, they were already building forts. Obviously, after the Battle of Manassas, they're going to build several more as George McClellan comes over, takes command of the armies around D.C. And I like to say the defenses of Washington evolved during the war. So by the end of 1861, you'll see about 48 forts around D.C., into 62 and into 63, you'll see about 60. By the time Early gets to D.C., there's going to be 68 major forts around the capital, supported by 93 batteries or gun positions or cannon positions. 30 miles of military road connected the forts. About 35 miles of earthworks connected all the forts around the city. The soldiers themselves and civilian laborers cut down about 20,000 acres of trees for open fields of fire to help build their earthworks, barracks, other structures, and the forts mounted about 800 cannons. So when we talk about Washington, D.C. being one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world, that's one of the things we'd like to talk about. Because when we're at a place like Gettysburg, or if you go down to Virginia and see Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, you always read about federal army commanders having to protect D.C., or at least keep in mind that D.C. needs to be protected. So when they move forward with their offensive campaigns, in the back of their mind, they have to keep D.C. There, right? Just in case we have to fall back into the protection of the forts at D.C. That's all going to change in 1864. When Grant goes through his overland campaign, takes a lot of casualties, he's going to strip the defenses of the heavy artillerists, and that will provide an opportunity when Early comes up through the valley to attack the city.
So really, it's not only an idea of the impact of Washington and militarily, but it's also the impact of it environmentally. They're cutting down all these trees. They're changing the landscape. They're doing all that just to begin with.
Yes, and affecting a lot of the civilian landowners in the area. If you own a lot of property, or you own property on high ground or strategic avenues of approach to the city, the Army just came in and they took over your land. So I gave a program today to about 30 people. We were north of Rock Creek Park, the Nature Center and Planetarium, and there's a fort there called Fort DeRussy, which would be heavily engaged in the Battle of Fort Stevens. There's a gentleman that owned property there, about 90 acres when the war started. The Army occupied 88 acres of his land during the war. So he would spend the next 20 years or so, filing claims of damages against the federal government. So just imagine the Army just coming in, altering your landscape, and saying, hey, you'll get this when it's over. And then conversely, there's a lot of stuff coming into the city as well. So my focus is really shifted from the military aspect to what the forts mean to people coming in. They become beacons of freedom for literally 40 to 50,000 formerly enslaved African Americans come into the city during the Civil War, and they have to pass by the forts. So I'm reading those accounts right now. A lot of them are written in regimental histories of federal regiments that built and occupied the forts. And as early as January 1862, especially for the soldiers that are on the Maryland line, right? They're told, this Fugitive Slave Act is still, it's still there. Maryland is a part of the United States, and so you have to obey federal law. The soldiers on the ground, they're just not obeying by that. So slavery breaks down on the ground, and you see this interaction. I call it the interaction of slavery and freedom in D.C. So the soldiers say, we're not going to follow those rules. We're not returning these people back to their owners. And they start hiring on a lot of these, especially young men and even young boys, as camp servants and cooks and things like that, even servants. And so we have these wonderful images of encampments around D.C., And right by the forts, and there's literally images of young black men in uniform living in and around the forts. So slavery really does break down in the confines of Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of different things we can talk about because, Fort Stevens is 2 days. People are in D.C. for 3 to 4 years. So there's a lot of stuff that we like to talk about and really unravel. And I always talk about layers of history, and we just like to peel it back piece by piece and let people connect to that.
What about the soldiers who were actually there? If we're talking about them over time, what kind of soldiers are we talking about? How are they seen by others? Things like that.
That's a great question, and that actually changes. I always talk about the evolution of the defenses of Washington. So the original men that are in the forts are actually the Army of the Potomac, the 3-year enlistees that are part of General McClellan's First Grand Army. They come in, the majority of them will come in after First Manassas or Bull Run, and they're given orders to fortify the city. That's why by the end of 1861, there's 48 major forts around the city, and they'll live in encampments near or around the forts. And those are the original guys. When they leave for the Peninsula Campaign in March of 62, and then you'll see different units come in, and that's when the heavy artillerists come in, these massive regiments up to 1,600 men strong. They're generally not all together or unified until they go and fight in Virginia, but they're organized to specifically serve in the defenses of Washington. They're there to operate the large caliber guns from 100-pound Parrott rifles to 15-inch Rodman guns that could fire 400-pound shells. And that's what they're trained to do. Every single day they do firing. They've got the range set on the countryside after they've cut down all the trees. And they're supposed to be there for the remainder of the war until 1864 when the Overland Campaign goes through and Grant needs reinforcements. And then you've got civilian employees as well. There's a lot of people that are being employed to work on the forts, including formerly enslaved African Americans, even civilian contractors as well, overseers, guys that are overseeing the construction. Everything is under the direction of the Army and the Corps of Engineers, but there's a lot of people that are getting employment just through the defenses of Washington itself.
So I used to be a civilian contractor alongside the Corps of Engineers. So this is near and dear to my heart now. What is the situation like 155 years ago in those forts after these men have been removed to go with Grant and to go to the Overland Campaign? What's the situation like in that area at that time?
That's a great question. Well, as I said, there's supposed to be at least 25,000 heavy artillerists in the city at all times. In June of 1864, about 18,000 are sent to the front. So they're going to completely deplenish the force in Washington, and they're going to fill them in with rear echelon soldiers. So you hear a lot about the Veteran Reserve Corps, formerly the Invalid Corps, men that could no longer see heavy campaigning. Instead of sending these gentlemen home, they are like, let's use these guys so we can free up able-bodied men to go to the front. So a lot of these gents will be in the forts, and then you're also going to see National Guard troops that sign up for 100 days. They're going to, the state governors are going to fill up these quotas set forth by the Lincoln administration, and for these men that sign up for 100 days, they'll avoid the draft. So you've got a lot of 100-day men in and around the forts. And their goal is to, again, release men to go to the front. They're not supposed to be doing any heavy fighting. They'll be guarding government property. The Veteran Reserve Corps even helped enforce the draft as well. So when Early comes towards D.C., he's facing really secondary troops, if you'd like to say. And the famous story, or the famous unit at Fort Stevens, Company K of the 150th Ohio National Guard, they're Oberlin College students. So think about like the Pennsylvania students here in the 26th emergency, a lot like that, right? They're there for 100 days, and Early comes down, and the first soldier killed in action was a college student from Oberlin College. So when this, I call it the Capitol Crisis of 1864, this is the famous battle where they organize about 1,500 government clerks from the quartermaster department. They empty hospitals. They literally even empty the Navy Yard and send sailors up to the forts. I like to say every hand on deck, literally. So they're doing everything they can to secure the city long enough for reinforcements to arrive.
So what is Early's situation at this time? General Early, of course, we know him from here at Gettysburg. His men are pretty battle hardened by this time, obviously. So they're coming into this area with what determination? What are they trying to do?
Well, Early's orders somewhat changed throughout this campaign he embarks on. He's first sent off to Lynchburg to help relieve John Breckinridge, who's duking out with David Hunter and the Army of West Virginia. So, they're coming literally on the rear of Richmond there. And when Early arrives there, David Hunter vacates the valley completely against orders. He's not supposed to do that. And so you're going to see this over the span of the next 2 or 3 weeks as Early marches down the valley going north. There's ominous reports coming from federal intelligence and the railroad lines. Hey, there's a large Confederate force in the valley. And they send this information down to Grant at City Point, and Grant's like, oh, no, David Hunter's there. Don't worry, David Hunter will take care of that. And, they get till early July, and they're like, bro, I don't think David Hunter's coming. He was all the way in West Virginia, completely cleared the valley. So, there's a small force, the Reserve Division of the Army of West Virginia under Phan at Harpers Ferry, which in many ways Early will bypass. But he crosses the Potomac River, I believe, on July 5th. And by this point, the railroads and scouts and things like that, they're communicating with Lew Wallace at Baltimore in command of the Middle Department. And Lew Wallace decides to make a stand on the Monocacy River. So that's why we're so connected to that battlefield there. They call it the battle that saved Washington because Lew Wallace was kind of in the backwaters in command of the Middle Department in Baltimore, after his early issues at Shiloh with U.S. Grant. He's kind of been sent away, and he's got a pretty small force of irregular troops himself. There's going to be Ohio National Guard troops there. There's going to be the Potomac Home Brigade, Veteran Reserve Corps. So really rear echelon troops, and he's going to hold the line as long as possible along the Monocacy River outside of Frederick, long enough for reinforcements to be sent up from Grant.
When we did the live stream, we had Ryan Quint on our live stream, and he wrote the book for Emerging Civil War about Monocacy. And he had the opportunity, he went to the area where Lew Wallace was from, and he had the opportunity to buy a shirt that said, "Ben Hur done that."
I love it.
And I'm like, dude, you bought it, right? And he's like, no, I didn't buy it. I'm like, oh, come on, man. That's a great shirt. But yeah, a lot of people forget that he wrote Ben Hur later on. But with him holding them off for a day at Monocacy, that does that change the overall effect of that thrust for Early as he's making his way towards Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the timeline of what's going on here, so he delays Early by 1 full day. Early ends up fighting Lew Wallace for about 8.5 hours on July 9th, 1864, which he didn't expect to do. And a large, Lew Wallace was able to hold on for so long because James Ricketts' division of the 3rd Corps had been sent up all the way to Baltimore on transport ships, and then they were taken by railroad all the way out to Monocacy River. So there were about 5,000 men of the 3rd Division of the 6th Corps. These are veterans, and they're going to support his left flank, and they're going to fight ferociously throughout the day on July 9th. So much so that when Lew Wallace is finally driven off the field, one of the battles where the Federals are outnumbered and outgunned by artillery, he writes a pretty ominous message to Washington around 9 o'clock on the evening of July 11th, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm marching with a half demoralized, tired, exhausted column. I think the men of the 6th Corps fought magnificently. 2 regiments of the 6th Corps are recovering my treat. I'll do everything I can to make it back to Baltimore. And then he also says, and I always kind of underline this, you'll have to make every exertion to save Washington. That's a pretty ominous message because there's no one else in the way. It's about 40 miles from Frederick, Maryland to Washington, D.C., and that was it. And so when he gets to the outskirts of the city on July 11th, around 12 o'clock on July 11th, he's not too far away. They're moving towards the northern defenses, towards Fort Stevens, and at 12 o'clock, the Federals manning the forts hear a report that the 6th Corps has arrived off the 7th Street Wharf. They've arrived off the Potomac River. And they'll get there late in the afternoon, early evening time. By that point, Early had been driven off by reinforcements that had already arrived internally from the city. But imagine if Early had another full day. This would have been one full day before the 6th Corps arrived, and also elements of the 19th Corps as well. They're coming from the Department of Gulf or the Gulf of Mexico. They just happen to be on transport ships by Petersburg. They're supposed to be there to reinforce Grant, and he sends these guys up the river. They don't even leave the boats. So you got about 15,000 men on their way to D.C., and Wallace is able to delay them about one full day. Made a huge difference.
So those 19th Corps guys are actually coming from New Orleans, right?
That's right.
And they're not even off the boat.
They're not even off the boat. And if you look at the men that are sent up to help reinforce Washington, they become the nucleus of the Army of the Shenandoah later in the year. So you've got elements of the 6th Corps, you've got the Army of West Virginia, you've got the 19th Corps. The only thing that's really missing is Sheridan and the cavalry that he brings up with him. That's the nucleus of the Army of the Shenandoah. That's going to duke it out with Jubal Early for the rest of the fall. So it all kind of makes sense. It leads. We just talk about one evolution after the another, right? You've got the Battle of Fort Stevens, Early retreats, and then heads west, and he doesn't really go anywhere. He hangs out in the area long enough to pester Lincoln that he calls for Grant to send someone up here to take command of all the troops in the area and defeat Early. He ends up sending Phil Sheridan.
How important is this whole action because it's an election year?
I think it's one of the biggest reasons you see Lincoln so active in regards to, first of all, releasing so many men from the defenses of Washington. I kind of feel like he's pushing all the chips into the table. When Grant asks for men, he's going to send them as men, right? And it's really interesting. There's a really interesting kind of dialogue between Grant and Petersburg and Lincoln and Washington, because they're writing each other messages back and forth about the military situation. And you really see Lincoln evolve as a commander-in-chief. And at one point, before the 6th Corps arrives up to D.C., he says, "This is not an order, just a suggestion. What do you think about you coming up here, taking command of all the forces coming together around D.C., and destroying this force?" At this point, they know it's Jubal Early commanding Ewell's Corps. "And you take command of the troops and destroy this enemy force before they cross the Potomac River and reunite with Lee." And Grant's like, "I'm sending a capable officer, Horatio Wright of the 6th Corps, and other officers as well, including Quincy Gilmore. Quincy Gilmore will command elements of the 19th Corps. And I believe that this force will never make it back across the Potomac River." But it's really interesting to see this dialogue here, right? And you can tell they really trust each other. And, they believe that, all right, if you think you've got a capable officer coming up here, then I'll trust you with that, and we'll go from there.
This is also the same period where Lincoln hits the front line.
That's right. Yeah, this is the famous battle, and since I've got my friends from Gettysburg here, Lincoln was not here to dedicate a cemetery. He was here to see the action. Okay, so there are numerous accounts. I see my friends laughing in the corner, but we actually believe Lincoln was out there on both days. So he arrived because he's around the Lincoln's Cottage, or the summer residence or summer White House, and he's operating between there and the executive office or the White House. And he's around the city. He wants the citizens in the city to see him and basically calm the nerves down, right? Because you've got refugees fleeing in from Maryland. You've got government clerks being armed. You've got volunteer companies of civilians being armed, right? It's kind of crisis in many ways. So he's out there to kind of calm the nerves of everyone in town. And when he hears the action goes on, we have accounts that he was out there on July 11th at Fort Stevens for about an hour, perhaps, until about noon, when he hears that the 6th Corps has arrived off the Potomac River. Apparently, from that point, he's going to ride all the way down to the Potomac River and welcome the troops off the transport ships. So this is one of the kind of the great episodes of the campaign, because the 6th Corps soldiers remember seeing Lincoln, and they're having a great old time and talking to the president as they're coming off the ships. This is the famous line where apparently Lincoln tells the soldiers, "You can't be late if you want to get early," right? Everyone laughs about that, okay? I love it. One of my favorite dad jokes from Lincoln. And so they send these guys directly up the road towards Fort Stevens. That today we call that Georgia Avenue, and they come straight up. So that's the first day. The second day is the kind of mythical day when he comes out on July 12th, sometime in the early to late afternoon. He's welcomed at the fort by Horatio Wright of the 6th Corps, escorted to the front, and starts kind of pacing the parapet, observing the action in front of him. There was a surgeon standing next to him from the 102nd Pennsylvania. He actually writes a really candid account about this, and he says, I'm standing by the president, and I hear like a thud on, and the sound that everyone knows of a bullet hitting, a human body, and it turned out to be his own leg. So the surgeon is severely wounded, is removed from the fort, and this is where all the stories come in of, someone yelling to the president to get down, you fool, get down, you damn fool, what are you doing? You're going to get yourself shot. There's 30 to 40 people that claim to tell Lincoln to do that. I'm not exactly sure who did, including Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., right, the future Supreme Court Justice. We were just going through some of the files, and he didn't even write about that. Someone asked him if he had any recollections about Lincoln before he passed away, and he said no. So who knows? But the president was later escorted away from the fort back to the White House, and his press secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, just talked about how excited he was that he saw the action and he was back in the White House. So that's the account. Several of them, of course. And if you go to Battleground National Cemetery, you'll appreciate this, because we're at Gettysburg and there's so many monuments on the field. There's a monument in our cemetery to a federal regiment. I believe it's the 122nd New York. And it says, like, dedicated to the men who fought in the defense of Washington in the presence of Abraham Lincoln, right on the monument, right? So after the war, of course, everyone wants to be associated with Abraham Lincoln in his memory. So every single person says, I saw Lincoln in action. I told him to get down. And if we look at the maps, we're like, your regiment was like 2 miles away. There was probably no way in heck, but who knows, right? So it's a part of the, and that's why the story has become so famous, because the president was out there under fire.
It's kind of like the story here at Gettysburg, where the veterans would come back later on, and they claimed that like over 300,000 veterans claimed they were at Gettysburg.
Right, exactly.
And there's absolutely no way, obviously.
Well, I'll also give you another Gettysburg connection. My friend Abner Doubleday was out in D.C. So the one thing that the defenses of Washington had in the summer of 1864 is they had a lot of forts, they had a lot of guns, and they had a lot of out-of-work generals. And I'm going to give you this list of out-of-work generals that they put to work. First and foremost is Alexander McCook, formerly of the 20th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland. Think of Chickamauga fame. He's been out of work since Chickamauga and has been awaiting orders. So he's recalled by Secretary of War Stanton and Halleck to the War Department, and due to his rank, I believe he was promoted to Major General in like July of '62. Like, he was a senior guy on the field, so he commanded all the northern defenses, right? You also got Montgomery Meigs, the Quartermaster General. He's going to command frontline troops and the Quartermaster Department, 1,500 men. You've got Abner Doubleday, who was looking for work since Gettysburg in many ways, and they send him out to the southeast forts. Abner Doubleday gets out there and he reports back, I see forts, but I don't see any men out here. So what do you want me to do? Well, Halleck writes back, actually, don't take command of the forts. Come back to the city and take charge of the Union Loyal League of Men. So this volunteer group of citizens, you're in charge of them, okay? So you got Abner Doubleday, and then you've got Quincy Gilmore. He's been relieved of duty with the Army of the James down in Virginia, and he's sent up here for orders as well, and he's going to take command of elements of the 19th Corps. So I call it reaching for the stars, right? There's so many out-of-work generals. And actually, my favorite account, and I think everyone will appreciate this, there's a brigadier general on 5th Street in New York City. He writes to Henry Halleck, the chief of staff, and says, hey, can I render my services? And Henry Halleck has one of the best drop your mic moments, I believe, in the Civil War. And he literally says to this brigadier general, we have 10 times as many generals as we do privates. If you're willing to send privates, they'll be happily accepted. So that's kind of what they were dealing with in D.C. So there was about 12,000 or so troops, they say, in the northern defenses when the battle began. But as I said, most of them were rear echelon troops.
So you have well over 60 forts around there at that time.
That's right.
And all these miles of basically entrenchments or connecting roads and, and bridges and stuff. What is the legacy of that post-war? How's that change?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, the forts are around to about April of 1866. There's actually, you're going to see a lot. So some of the images you see of like the USCT regiments in the forts, the famous image of those black soldiers lined up against the barracks there, that's Fort Lincoln. That's in Northeast D.C. So a lot of those USCT regiments were raised in 1863, signed up for 3-year enlistments, so they have to be around for another year or so. So they're in D.C. until about 1866. The chief engineer that takes over for John Barnard's, he tells the War Department, who, after Lee surrenders, are like, hey, let's just get rid of the forts and, so we don't have any more expenditure. And he writes back, well, he's like, do you realize what happened like 3 years ago or 4 years ago when we didn't have any defense in the city? So he's like, I think we should keep some around. So he writes a report. The forts are classified in 3 different classes, first, second, and third. The first class, we're going to keep these forts around. There's about 20 of them. Second class, reserve status. Third class, which will be the majority of them, will be abandoned and returned to the private landowners. The Army actually goes in. They take out, obviously, the munitions and artillery pieces, and then they auction off the property of the forts to try to pay back the federal coffers, which is really interesting. There are some forts, if you look on your brochure there, the first image on the front of it is Fort Foote. You see that large caliber gun on the front of it. That was in service until 1873, 74. So there were forts that that stayed in commission for another 4, 5, 6 years. And what's really important about Fort Foote is it's the precursor to the Endicott system with the coastal batteries, because they've got these 15-inch rodmans on the coast, on the Potomac River, and they're testing like disappearing carriages. They're testing unreinforced concrete. So they're just trying all these different things that by the 1880s will become the Endicott coastal defense system. So I believe that's one of the rare sites in the country that is a Civil War site turned pre-Endicott system. So as I said, the majority of the forts return to the civilian landowners. The majority of them are knocked down. People build property again. They build farms and stuff like that. There are tons and tons of people that will file claims of damages against the federal government. Some people are awarded money, others are not. By 1890, there's a group of Washingtonians, including veterans, that want to preserve the defenses of Washington as early as 1891. So they're going to spend the next literally 60 years trying to figure out what that means. So if you look at our map and you see all the sites in blue, those are NPS sites. They created something called Fort Drive. And the idea was to build this boulevard around the city, comparable to Paris, basically, where citizens of D.C. could ride out in their carriages and go and see the forts and enjoy nature and history. That never really worked out due to funding and the urban growth of the city. But if you see that arc now, that's the legacy of Fort Drive. And you can go to places in D.C. and see the streets, and it says Fort Drive. That's all NPS property. So we may not be connected by one clear road, but you do see the arc around the city. So as I said, of the original 68 plus 93 batteries, we manage 17 sites. Arlington County manages about 3. Alexandria manages 3 or 4 sites as well. So not too bad for post-Washington, D.C.
Right. So if anyone here or watching wants to go to some of these spots, what are some that you would say are you have to go see this? This is the one. I mean, all of them are important, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I would suggest if they're in Virginia, Northern Virginia, go to Fort Ward, which is managed by Alexandria, and they've got a wonderful museum there, and they've got reconstructed earthworks. And I've been working with their staff. I've also been working with the staff from Arlington County as well. They've got Fort C. F. Smith and Fort Ethan Allen. They just opened up a new visitor center at Fort C. F. Smith on the weekends for a couple hours. Go and check that out. We'll be doing some programs with them during the fall. And if you come to the Park Service side, definitely see Fort Stevens. Talk about post-war reclamation. Fort Stevens was rebuilt by the CCC in 1937-38. So that's also a really cool story. We've got images of the fort in the early 1900s where you can still see the embrasures and the earthworks. The majority of the fort is gone. But in 1937, the CCC came in and rebuilt a section of the fort, and it's still there today. I would say be sure to visit Battleground National Cemetery, where my office is. The lodge itself is not open to the public, but the grounds are. And if you're in D.C., I mean, just follow us on our Facebook page, Civil War Defenses of Washington. It's a National Park Service page, or go to our website, nps.gov/CWDW, and just send me a message. I'd be happy to meet you and give you a free tour and show you what we have.
Yeah, and we're talking about in the future, Steve and I getting together in Chinatown doing big history in Little Chinatown.
That's right. We're going to do that.
So we're talking about doing that. We got to do that live too, I think.
So as I said, I do a lot of different history in D.C. because there's so much Civil War history, and I talked to Chris about this last year from Gettysburg and staff at other parks, MPS parks that do history at Sunset, which I know are really popular with the public. And I just started thinking about sites in D.C. that we could do history at Sunset at. And the first site I did last summer was, let's do Fort Stevens, but let's not even talk about the battle. And so the idea of doing it at Fort Stevens, I think, was kind of like the beacon to bring people in. But I talked about the interaction of, former slaves or enslaved people coming into federal lines, and we had really vivid, candid accounts from the soldiers in the camps around D.C. that talked about that. And the visitors really enjoyed that program because the landscape in D.C. has changed so dramatically. It was kind of really insightful to kind of talk about those stories. We did one at Logan Circle. If anyone's been to D.C., John Logan, the Major General in the Union Army, he's buried in D.C., and GAR and all that stuff. And so there's a really great monument to him there. But during the Civil War, it was called Camp Barker, formerly like a cavalry camp, but it became this large contraband camp during the war where thousands of former slaves came into federal lines. They were put in this area, and there was so much death and disease in that area, they built Contraband Hospital. So there was a contraband hospital just a few blocks away, and so we talked about that. And so this year, coming up on August 2nd, I'll be at President Lincoln's cottage, and we'll talk about, it's called Lincoln at War. And I'm working with their wonderful staff there. They've got a wonderful education team. And Lincoln spends a good portion of his presidency at his summer cottage, where they dedicate one of the first national cemeteries, and he sees the war get bigger and bigger, and what the toll it takes on families, and even his own psyche and what it's doing to the country. So he reflects quite a bit there, and I'll be talking about his kind of role as commander-in-chief, which evolves moving forward. So there's a lot of stuff we can do in D.C., and we're just trying to connect visitors to as many stories and people and human interest accounts as we can.
And you are doing a great job of it, because I'm always seeing you on there doing stuff. So
I appreciate that. Yeah, there's a lot to do, and I've got a lot of fans that I'm trying to connect with, right, here and there. So we're I feel like we're doing it right. We've gauged a lot of interest. When I first started, there was maybe 3 or 4 people on programs, and now we're getting 50 to 60 to 90 people. So I'm happy to say that despite what you read in the papers, history is not dead, and people are really interested in history and the Civil War, and they just want to be connected to it or given the opportunity to go out and experience these events, these places. And that's what we're trying to do, not only in the Park Service, but things like Tattooed Historian and all these other history organizations and associations and parks and museums, and we're just doing our part to connect visitors to history.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I'm so glad that you were able to join us this evening to talk about the Civil War defenses at Washington. And I'm so glad that you all came out. We're going to have time for Q&A, but first I want to thank Steve for coming
I appreciate
out.
it.
And thank you all for coming out. I saw a couple hands while we were going around, so we'll do some Q&A here real quick.
So the question is, of all the properties that the government acquired
Yes,
for
indeed.
forts, and they auctioned those off, how many different properties did they auction off that were private individual properties, and then they just took that and then sold that to fill their government coffers, or did they give them all back to private?
It was a mix of both, actually. And they did not, what they were auctioning off was the military property. So if they built abattis, the sharpened sticks around the fort, they sold those. Finished wood within the fort, the barracks themselves, they would sell stuff like...
They sold the contents, not the actual...
Exactly. And in many cases, they're like, hey, we know we knocked your property down, but you want this barrack over here, you know? And sometimes people would say yes, and other times they would say no. The most famous story we have is at Fort Stevens, there was a small community of freed African Americans on the D.C. Maryland line. Apparently the area was called Vinegar Hill. We're not exactly sure why. And when Fort Stevens was built, it was originally called Fort Massachusetts. They knocked down this African American church. And then in 62, when the forts expanded and became Fort Stevens, goes from literally 200-yard perimeter to almost 400 yards. It almost doubles in size. They knocked down the property of Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and her family, a free black woman, and she became like the local heroine of the Battle of Fort Stevens because she becomes intimately connected with the story of Lincoln as well. So she spends literally the next 50 years trying to file claims against the government for damages, okay? And it's really interesting. So by the 1890s, you've got reporters talking to her. You've got veterans talking about her. And in many ways, like any of the Civil War combat veterans, you know, she's going to kind of fluff her story up a little bit, right? She's like, no, I was the one that told Lincoln to get down. You know, Lincoln came up to me and patted me on the shoulder when they knocked my house down. Most likely, you know, that was most likely apocryphal, of course. And there was a reporter in the Washington Evening Star that said, you know, every time I talk to her, her story gets more elaborate. And I actually think that makes a lot of sense. She's connected to the battle because she's also looking out for the future of her family as well. So she's trying to get, I want to be the heroine of the Battle of Fort Stevens, right? Maybe that will help my family out. So there's a really wonderful image of her at the dedication of this boulder where Lincoln was apparently shot at. It was dedicated in 1911 by both Union and Confederate soldiers, and there she is sitting on a chair, right? And she tells the story of telling Lincoln, yeah, I told that damn fool to get down, you know? It's really interesting. So we've got like, I don't even know where this account came from. We're still trying to figure it out. That said, yes, that she was finally granted, you know, a claim in like 1915 or so. She had died, I believe, in 16. And so she still has descendants in the family. And they say that, you know, she didn't receive the money. So what I think happened was she might have gotten approved for the claim, and then when she passed away, it kind of just went away. So apparently there was a book being written by her by someone associated with the family or even a family member. I don't know all the details, but they've got a lot more information about her that we are waiting to hear about because we just don't know. So from the research that I have found, and this is not to denigrate Elizabeth Thomas at all, you know, because here's an example, you know, was she in the fort during the battle? I don't believe so because Mary Todd Lincoln was apparently with Lincoln at the fort and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and I have found accounts that said they wouldn't allow them into the fort. Because, well, her specifically, they didn't want women in the battle line, right? So if they didn't allow Mary Todd Lincoln, I don't believe they would have allowed Elizabeth Thomas into the fort, right? We believe she relocated south of the fort after her property was knocked down. But the story is still evolving, right? And we're still trying to figure out kind of fill in the gaps there, right? So I'm trying to be as thoughtful because I mean she's a very popular person in the city, you know. So I want to respect that, but also kind of dig really deep and find out kind of what really happened. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that when Early's campaign started to roll, Grant was not concerned because he thought Hunter
That's right.
was in position to block him. How did Hunter manage to lose? Well, we know how he lost contact with Early. He ran away.
Right.
But how did Grant finally realize that Hunter was not in place and out of contact?
A lot of reports from Harpers Ferry, and one of them being the much maligned Franz Siegel, who actually I think serves pretty well at Harpers Ferry, and at that point in late June, early July of '64, and he's like, "There's a large force that's going around us." Early sends a token force to kind of really see what's going on, but when they cross the river, it's actually the president of the Baltimore and Ohio, Mr. Garrett, that is highly influential, and he's the one that actually sends rail cars out to Baltimore to ship the Sixth Corps troops out to the Monocacy River. And he's in contact not only with Halleck, but with the War Department and with the Secretary of War as well. So at that point, because Grant still believes, they're like, well, that's why Hunter's there. And Halleck just is like, no way. He's like, there's no way this guy's going to come back. He's not a big fan of Halleck, of Hunter to begin with. He says he's even worse than Siegel. I mean, he drops this bomb on him when he writes this message. I found this in the ORs the other day. I'm like, oh my God, just talk about smack talk, right? But he's like, I just don't believe we'll ever make it back. And then when Hunter is in West Virginia, he starts messaging the War Department. He's like, yeah, I'm a couple days behind right now. That's when they sound the alarm.
Any other questions?
Well, not a question, but I would like to tell everybody, if you're interested in the Civil War, get the book by, what's his name? Bruce Catton, A Silence at Appomattox. You got to read this. It's post Gettysburg, but boy oh boy, it just takes you from one battle to another battle, makes you cry. It's just what a book. So it's by Bruce Catton, The Silence at Appomattox. You gotta read it. I can't believe I'm reading. I don't read.
I would say if you're more interested in the defenses of Washington,
Have you ever read that?
I've started reading Bruce Catton at the suggestion of my friend Chris over here because he writes so well. He really does.
Trilogy.
Yeah, right. So I think if you're more interested in the defenses of Washington, want to learn more about the forts, the standard book, I call it the Fort Bible, is called Mr. Lincoln's Forts. It's by Dr. Benjamin Franklin Cooling. He has written about the forts for about 50 years. Him and Wally Owen from Fort Ward co-authored that. They've written 3 or 4 editions, and it is the standard. They have every single fort and battery discussed. They talk about their perimeter, how many guns they had, which units were there. They tell you how to go out and see if it's still there. So that's the go-to right there, Mr. Lincoln's Forts. It's still being printed.
Well, I'm going to let Steve go and drink the rest of his beer.
Cheers.
And thank you all for coming out, and thank you again, Steve, for
Thank
being
you.
a part
Appreciate
of this. Thank you all again. Stick around for a little while if you like. We'll be here for a little while.
Thanks for coming out, Chris Quinn.
Yes. Thank you, Chris.
He's a busy guy.